and to be able to make sense, especially of some of the things that are happening in Israel right now. So now, what I also want to say, one last thing, is that that we kind of pulled this as a last second kind of a thing, and so it's a mildly outside of our synagogue budgeting. If you find this to be meaningful and helpful, and you would like to just make a little small contribution to the temple and literally write in, Uri's class. So there's no charge for being here, but if you want to help defray, offset the costs, we would always be delighted for you to do so. Please just make a contribution and just kind of say because of Uri's class, and it'll help us know why you did it. All right, so I think I'm going to turn it over to Uri at this time. Thank you again, Uri, for being here. And I'm just going to, again, look for a way to record this, record on this computer. And all right, so, and.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rabbi. And it is wonderful to be back with all of you. As I mentioned last time, if we don't get to questions, or if your questions only arise later after we've departed ways, hopefully my email was shared last time, but Rabbi, feel free to put my email in the chat so that people can follow up if they have any questions that come up and are not answered. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to jump right in. For those of you who were not with us last time, hopefully you'll get a chance, if you haven't already, to see the recording. But we are going to pick it up right where we left off, and we'll try and connect some of the dots. So as we do, there's a little bit of a beeping, but we will... Oh, I don't think you're hearing that, so that's okay. And I will share my screen like that and like that. Great. Okay. Once again, we see the main photo that will be with us throughout our course. And again, it is a starting point, but it's not the starting point. And the reason it's not the starting point is because, well, we weren't created in a vacuum on May 14th, 1948. And therefore, we know that we have these headings that you see in front of you, that there are only 6 of them, because the last 2 sessions, as we mentioned, will be focused on what has happened since October 7th. But if last time we began with Zionism, and we looked at what that term means, first of all, and where it begins, and we identified that Zionism is a modern word from the 19th century, it reflects an age-old yearning to return to the land of Israel. Now, while that's all well and done, it doesn't end with our last session last time, because if you remember, we ended at the end of the 19th century towards the beginning of the 20th century, and we concluded our time together, among other things, with Theodor Herzl. And in today, as you can see, we've titled it Waves, War, and the Mandate Begins, and we're actually going to see how far into the British Mandate we can get to today, and we'll see how we go. But just to remind us all, Theodor Herzl, born in 1860, and we spoke about the trajectory of his life and how, while set on a particular path, growing up within a very Jewish world, although not the traditional Jewish world, but more of that enlightened to become known as a secular Jewish identity that led him and his family from Budapest through Vienna, ultimately through law school, and then continuing his life as a writer, which placed him front and center for a major moment in Jewish history, which was the Dreyfus Affair, which would set him on a new trajectory that would ultimately land him at the helm of the Jewish world in the First World Zionist Congress in 1897. This, of course, would be the platform in which he would set in motion what would ultimately become a Jewish state. And he says himself, in no less than 5 years and no more than 50 years, there'll be a Jewish state. And if we look 50 years from 1897, we, of course, get to the year 1947, when the United Nations says yes to a partition plan. Theodor Herzl himself, however, will die at a young age of 44 in 1904, but not before he sets in motion what would become essentially a tidal wave that would change the Jewish nation forever. He didn't invent Zionism, but he was absolutely there at a very critical watershed moment. Now, as part of our journey, we're not just looking at large, zoomed out pictures, but we want to talk about individuals as well. And last time, you remember, we spoke about Chemda, Ben Yehuda and Eliezer Ben Yehuda as really this couple, this power couple, the founders of the modern Hebrew language. We also can't not speak about Chaim Nachman Bialik. Chaim Nachman Bialik, who grew up in a traditional world of Judaism within the Russian Empire at the time, what would become ultimately Ukraine. Everyone was originating in a traditional Jewish upbringing. But the reason I want to talk about him is not just because he becomes the national poet of the state of Israel, which is very interesting considering that he dies in 1934, obviously 14 years before the founding of the state of Israel. And the truth is, he only spent the last 10 years of his life in Palestine, as it was called back then, the land of Israel. We will see that Chaim Nachman Bialik, who grows up in that traditional world, by the age of 13, he is considered a Talmudic prodigy, and he leaves for the prestigious yeshiva of Volozhin in Lithuania to study Talmud in real depth, although he also wanted to focus on a more modern yeshiva study, which would include Bible, Tanakh. Because really the focus of, if you were serious, especially coming within the Lithuanian traditional Jewish world, Talmud was what it was all about. At a certain point, he's going to break away from that yeshiva world, and he's drawn to the city of Odessa. And in Odessa, he's going to find, you can see there at the southern arm of the Pale of Settlement, he is going to be caught up in Haskalah and Zionism, in really this new way of understanding what it meant to be a Jew. He'll be informed and influenced by the likes of Moshe Leib Lilienblum and Ahad Ha'am, some of the founders of real proponents of the evolution of Zionism. And we'll speak about some of these characters in more depth. Don't be concerned. He finds himself within the literary circles of Chovevei Tzion. Chovevei Tzion was the first group that gathered together in the early 1880s that even conceptualized what it would mean to replicate the Jewish people from Russia at that point, and ultimately the Jewish world outside the land of Israel to the land of Israel. By 1891, he publishes his first poem called El Hatzipor, to the bird, which he writes in Hebrew. Again, if you remember last time, we spoke about Eastern European Jewish enlightenment that had a different focus or a different way of achieving the same goal as Western and Central European Jewish enlightenment. And the harnessing of new languages wasn't, in fact, the local language of German, French, English, whatever it might have been, but rather to harness Hebrew for that same purpose. Now, while To the Bird is a powerful poem to dissect, I think we owe it to ourselves to jump head on into a different poem that he writes. And in 1903, already a prominent, well-known, almost household well-known name as a Jewish literary figure, he will be primed and ready for the events that unfold in the spring of 1903 in this town, Kishinev, that you can see circled in red. If it's too small, by the way, fortunately, we have a magnifying glass, and you can see it very clearly. I'm particularly proud of that, I'm just going to say. Either way, we know that in Kishinev, there's going to be a pogrom that unfolds, and the reason it unfolds during spring is because it's right on the cusp of Easter and, of course, Passover, and the rhetoric which is heard from the sermons in those Christian communities of the Eastern Orthodox Christians is going to be that Jews, once again, we're reminded of the false accusation, steal Christian babies and slaughter them to use their blood to make matzah. And this is going to create a terrible pogrom, an organized attack against Jews, in which 49 Jews will be killed. Now, I'm going to be crass for a moment, and I'm going to tell you that we have had worse before and worse after And yet there's something about this pogrom that will leave its mark on the evolution of what it means to be Jewish at the turn of the century. Now, the main reason that we know about this as such a momentous occasion is because the Jewish people hear about it. And the reason they hear about it is because Chaim Nachman Bialik will be commissioned to go to Kishinev by the literary circles of Odessa and of Poland, and he will be asked to document what he sees. And when he goes there and he sees the aftermath of this pogrom, he will ultimately write two very powerful epic poems, one of which is called In the City of Slaughter, of which I only provided a small excerpt because it's a very long-winded poem. But if we take a moment to see what he wrote, we will understand maybe a little bit better why this was a turning point. Arise and go now to the city of slaughter, into the courtyard, wind thy way. With thine hand touch and their eyes see. He goes on to say very, very clearly what happened. Behold, on a tree, on stone, on fence, on mural clay, the spattered blood and dried brains of the dead proceed through the ruins, the split walls where wider grows the hollow and greater grows the breach, pass over shattered earth, attain the broken wall whose burnt and barren brick, whose charred stone reveals the open mouths of such wounds that, well, you can read for yourself the painful rendition of his experience. And what's interesting is he goes and he writes, he intersperses the blood and the destruction and the bodies and the slayer slew and the blossom burst, he said. He doesn't avoid the beautiful nature that was around, that springtime was upon them. The sun was out, the flowers were blossoming, springtime was anew, and blood flowed through the streets. Then wilt thou flee to a yard, observe its mound. Upon the mound, he says, are both headless, a dog, a Jew and his hound. And he says, tomorrow the rain will wash away their mingled blood. This poem shocks the Jewish people to their core, not because it's the first time we've experienced this, but Bialik comes out fingers blaring of who's responsible. And it's not the Russians, it's the Jews. We are responsible. We allowed this to happen, because he goes on to say within this poem that while all this was happening, we Jews hid in the corner and we prayed to our God, please God, save us. And we even asked, as they defiled our wives, will she still be permissible to me? That was our concern. So it's very clear who brought this on. We brought this on. Now, if I'll pause for just a moment and I put into very seriously and emboldened parentheses, as we get to our last two sessions, and we talk about this war that we are now encountering since October 7th, 2023, what we found in Kibbutz Be'eri and Kibbutz Kfar Aza and Nirim and Nir Am and others, we found this being portrayed. This poem, which we thought we left behind with the founding of the State of Israel, seemingly presented itself anew. But I digress. Either way, this poem was going to change how we saw ourselves, and in fact would influence a whole new generation of Jews who said, Mom and Dad, love you very much. You're wrong, we're right. We know how to save the Jewish people. And it would be this poem that was written because of this pogrom that ignites a new wave of immigration to be known as the Second Aliyah, which we can pretty much identify between 1904 and 1914. Now, surprise, surprise, if Theodor Herzl really was not the founder of Zionism, but clearly the leader of what would be known as political Zionism, that is a top-down Zionism, let's create institutions of governance Let's create an international charter that would recognize that we Jews, in fact, have a right to an independent control over ourselves. Let's begin to build everything we need in which to function within this kind of independent state, and let's put it all into place. Aleph Dalet Gordon, or Aaron David Gordon, will be at the old age of 48, as it were, when he immigrated in 1904, is going to be one of the leaders of this second Aliyah, at least as far as the spirituality goes. And really, we can identify this second Aliyah as an Aliyah which, well, identifies itself not as inventing a new Judaism or a new religion, but reharnessing the religion as we knew it. That is, we will call it a religion of labor. And this will be known as labor Zionism. And the labor Zionism, first of all, the philosopher that he was, identifies A.D. Gordon as being one that, while he was very much a socialist, not within the realm of Marxism, meaning socialism for socialism's sake was not the goal. The goal was Zionism. The goal was creating a new Jewish reality in the land of Israel. Socialism was a tool with which to manifest the ideology of Zionism, and also a tool with which Jews and human beings in general, but specifically Jews, could reconnect to working the land of which Jews had been removed for 2,000 years. And this idea of reconnecting to the land would reinstate a natural state of human existence in this relationship that we should have with nature. Okay, now the essence of this second Aliyah, okay, very clear perhaps in the ideological form, but what about practicality? Is it enough to just go ahead and have this terrible pogrom happen to ignite Jewish existence in the land of Israel? Well, not exactly. There still has to be an ask, and anybody who's ever done any fundraising knows that nothing happens without the ask. And therefore, Menachem Usishkin, who is one of the early Zionist leaders at this time, is actually going to write a letter to the Jewish youth of Europe, and he's going to say in this letter, brothers and sisters, come, we need you, but please know this, it is difficult, it is dangerous, you might not even survive if you come, and you will definitely be hated by those who are here. You'll be hated by those you leave behind. You will miss your families, but come, we need you. Now, I never studied marketing, but I can tell you that anytime Rabbi Ari would send out a letter to invite you to join him on a trip to Israel, if he were to tell you, friends, come, it's gonna suck, I don't know how many people are joining in. So what is it about Menachem Usishkin that he's writing this particular letter? Well, lo and behold, there's more than one of these letters that sent out, and they actually get a response. And the response is from the president of his local Zionist chapter, youth movement, a guy by the name of David Green, who says, "Dear sir, we are a group of young men and bachelors and students who wish to immigrate to the land of Israel." I think somebody might not be on mute.
I took care of it.
Great. Immigrate to the land of Israel, to Eretz Israel. We know of the moral corruption devastating the settlers of the land. We know of the baseness of those who should be setting a noble example for all the diaspora. And we therefore see a great, if not the greatest, need to create a fresh national foundation in the land of our forefathers upon which to build the great structure of national revival. We are well aware of the enormous obstacles that we will find in our path. We are ready to work, suffer, endure in silence for the ideal that is the content of our lives, and to do this in the only land where we can find the solution to all of our ill and bitter problems. And then he goes on to say, dear brother, is this acceptable for the general progress of our movement's work? With the blessing of Zion, in the name of all of my friends, yours respectfully, David Green. David Green essentially says, Whatever you need, we are there. We will make it happen. You just tell us what you need. And David Green ultimately does make Aliyah. He ascends, he immigrates to the land of Israel, to what was then called Palestine. And this young Zionist leader from Plonsk, Poland, will later change his name to David Ben-Gurion. Now, David Ben-Gurion, among other things, will become the first prime minister of the state of Israel. And we see him in his various incarnations, including spending some time with Moshe Feldenkrais, who, among other things, a very renowned physicist, will also be one who, after a terrible soccer injury, relearns the mechanisms of the body and creates a whole opportunity to focus on muscles that allows for the development of a stronger individual. Either way, that's where we get the famous standing on the head. And we'll talk about Paula Ben-Gurion soon enough, because Paula Munweis, who David Ben-Gurion meets when he ultimately makes his way to New York because he's kicked out of Palestine by the Ottoman Turks during World War I. And I am getting ahead of myself. Paula, who was born in Russia but she immigrates to the United States when she's a teenager in 1910, will become a nurse in Newark, New Jersey, will meet him, will fall in love, and clearly Ben-Gurion had something going for him, this Che Guevara type, because he wasn't exactly a looker. But we do know that he, in many ways, swept her off of her feet, although she was always true to who she was. And she wasn't born a Zionist. In fact, she was very much against any kind of governance of this kind at all. And yet she joins him in the land of Israel, but was always ready to speak her mind. And anytime Moshe Feldenkrais would show up on their kibbutz later in their life, she would say, "Here comes Mr. Hocus Pocus." Either way, we know that David Ben-Gurion would be an integral part of the second Aliyah. In fact, when he immigrates, first he becomes part of a strong young guard that is to protect the Jewish communities that are being built in those early days of the second Aliyah, and then will become a farmer and goes up north to be part of the founding of the first kibbutzim. The kibbutz was the backdrop on which the ideology of Zionism, through the frame of socialism, would ultimately manifest itself on the ground in the land of Israel, living by the adage of work as much as you can, receive as much as you need. This was the ideal of the kibbutz, the collective. But again, if we want to speak about individuals, we have to speak about this young woman by the name of Rachel Blaustein. And in fact, if you were to walk through Israel today and you said to someone on the street, "What is your favorite poem by that poet Blaustein?" most likely you wouldn't necessarily get an answer. But if you were to go ahead, if you were to go ahead and say, "What is your favorite poem by that poet Rachel?" And for those of you with some Hebrew, you may notice on her grave, which is on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, in the cemetery of what was originally kibbutz and later Kfutzat Kinneret, you see only one name, Rachel. Then you would probably get this response: "Ah, Rachel." Now, there's a reason that there's a bench here by her grave and that there's a lid that covers a box, that if you lift that box, there is a book and several books of collections of her poetry, because Rachel was in fact a poet. But before that, she comes from Russia with her sister Shoshana to the land of Israel, to Palestine, not to immigrate, not as second Aliyah-ers, but as a tourist to check out the new community that's being built there by Jews on her way to Italy, where she's going to study art and philosophy. And yet she gets to the township, to the Moshava. Remember the first Aliyah, Moshava. And she gets to this place called Rehovot, and she falls in love with these young Jews, and she starts working in a kindergarten, and she's learning Hebrew along with these kids. Oh, and by the way, the reason she's learning Hebrew with these children is not because she's working with a group of young religious Jews, but actually the ideology of the second Aliyah is playing out in language as well, because these Jews who arrive are saying to their parents, Mom and Dad love you very much. We're right, you're wrong. We know how to save the Jewish people, and it is not by tapping into how we have lived our lives as Jews all the way through, but rather we have no need anymore of a synagogue. We have no need anymore of a rabbi or of Hebrew as it was a language for prayer and for study alone. But we are going to utilize Hebrew to be a tool that will allow us to tap into who we were eons ago, thousands of years ago, proud Jews living in our land independently. And Hebrew becomes our vernacular. And we will work the land of Israel ourselves and not hire the locals to do it with us or for us like those who came in the first Aliyah did. But we will work the land ourselves. And we will defend the land ourselves, because the first Aliyah that arrived also hired the locals. Those were the Arabs who were living here, to do that work with them or for them. Now, we have to be clear. The second Aliyahs, in all of that zeal that a teenager brings, and I'm sure some of us remember how we were at that age and how we thought of our parents perhaps being wrong of one thing or the other, or maybe we remember and even realize today that being on the receiving end of being told by our own teenagers that we're wrong about something. Human nature doesn't change, and they were going to change the world. And when they do, Rachel is caught up in this. And she meets a woman by the name of Hannah Meisel who says, hey, you look pretty cool. Why don't you come up north with me? We're going to start a training farm that will teach us how to be farmers, because these kids didn't know how to be farmers. And the Kinneret Training Farm was formed. And interesting enough, soon enough, the ideology that was spoken about in their old country of unity for all, equality for all, didn't play out as the men ended up being out in the field and the women were doing the laundry. And at a certain point, Hannah and Rachel and others said, that's the way it's going to be. We're out of here. And they went up the road and created a training farm just for women. Now, Rachel will also be of those who found the very first kibbutz, Kibbutz Degania of 1909 and 1910, and by 1913, it'll be clear her intellect and ability, and the kibbutz will send her to France to study agronomy, to bring it back to better utilize these tools as they develop their agriculture. Unfortunately, Rachel is caught up in World War I and is not able to return. She leaves school in France, in Toulouse, and she goes back to her home in Russia. She works during the war with refugee children. And when she returns in the third Aliyah, 1919 is when she returns to the kibbutz, very painfully, she has contracted tuberculosis. And soon enough, the kibbutz asks her to leave. She leaves for the better of the kibbutz, and she ends up in hospitals in Tzfat, in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, where she will ultimately finish out her life in 1931 when she dies at the age of 40. But Rachel will become such a prominent figure in the annals of the story of the Jewish people in the land of Israel that she will ultimately find herself to our 20 shekel bill. And that's Rachel there on the shores of the Kinneret, of the Sea of Galilee. But that just because she was a pioneer, an early Zionist, is not the reason, but it's because of the treasure trove that she left behind, which includes her poetry. That while she worked the land as long as she could with her hands, when she could no longer physically do that, she continued her poetry, which she begins at the age of 15 already. But this becomes her prominent pick and her prominent shovel, her pen. And of the poetry that she writes, I've brought just a few. To my land, she writes, I cannot offer you my land in praise, heroic deeds. One tree I planted on the way, which to the Jordan leads. One narrow path to my feet yields, which run across the fields. I know how humble are the gifts the child offers her mother. A cry of joy, one glorious day. Essentially, what she's doing is creating almost a dialogue in what clearly is a monologue, but this reference to the land is a motherly figure, and Rachel, who isn't able to accept what she has done other than to belittle these acts. I haven't done anything. All I've done was plant one tree. Now, I think we have to recognize that while she does write about this type of person and in many ways reflects who this generation was, seeing themselves as being almost insignificant and putting themselves second, even third before the greater picture. Not everything was like this, and it wasn't all dancing the hora around the bonfire late at night. And there was real pain and real terrible outcomes. And there were those who even took their own lives because they didn't fit in. These were teenagers with all of those issues that teenagers have. And there was real pain and anguish alongside with real thriving ideology. Perhaps it never was. Perhaps I never woke up early and worked the fields to labor in the sweat of my brow. She goes on to say that maybe this was all a dream. Maybe I never even was here. Maybe I didn't really reach my own potential. Oh, my Kinneret, were you there or did I only dream? Now, regarding reality on the ground, and in fact, was it all always a wonderful, glorious, rose-colored world? We know that Rachel, when she was in France, she meets a young man, Michael Bernstein. And when she ultimately goes back to Russia, as does he, they so deeply fall in love that they were on the cusp of getting married when Rachel has to decide whether or not to return to the land of Israel, which she ultimately does. Painfully, Michael doesn't want to, and she is torn between staying with her beloved or returning to her beloved. And it was this backdrop that this song is written. Zemer Nugeh, a sad song. And an Israeli band, the forerunners of Israeli rock, a Peter, Paul, and Mary-esque group with Shmulik Kraus and Jody Katz and Arik Einstein called Achalonot HaGvohim, the High Windows, in the late 1960s, will offer us a voice that we can hear that places these words within our grasp. And I say it in those words because while she writes of her own pain, the power of Rachel's voice is that she offered it for us, each of us, to be able to tap in. How does this poem reflect where I am? And do I, in fact, have my own sad song?
תשמע קולי, רחוקי שלי, תשמע קולי, באשר הנך, קול קורא בעוז, קול בוכה בדמי, ומעל הזמן מצווה ברכה. Rachel
Now, I know it's not going to be surprising when I tell you that we Jews did not see eye to eye. And it wasn't just Theodor Herzl down one path of what Zionism could be. And it's not just going to be a Chad Ha'am with labor Zionism during the second Aliyah, but there will be actually multiple ways of understanding what Zionism could look like, including what was called religious Zionism, or what later would be known as religious Zionism. By the way, I'm just going to put in parentheses for a moment, the fact that you're seeing these little sugar packets and coffee cup is because not too long ago, the Aroma Cafe chain here in Israel also produced a whole line of these sugar packets that had on the back of them all the who's who in the early days of Zionism. So while you have your Cafe Hafuch, you also get to know a little bit of our past as well. Either way, Rabbi Yitzchak Avram Kook is not necessarily going to be your run-of-the-mill traditional Orthodox Jew, because in many ways there were many who, remember we spoke about it last time, who built up even taller walls around their almost self-imposed, not even almost, their self-imposed ghetto in order to rid ourselves from the outside world, because we saw what was happening as we rid ourselves of that three-legged stand on which we had stood our entire lives as the Jewish people, the people of Israel, the land of Israel, and the religion of Israel. They said nothing good of this could come of this, and they were not going to force the hand of a messianic era, and therefore we're going to stay in the old country. There were, however, those like Rabbi Kook who said, no, no, no. We, just as the Tanakh itself tells us, need to be partners with God as the creation, not only of the world, but also in our establishment and reestablishment of ourselves in the land of Israel. And we don't have to reject those early secular Zionists, as they would later be known. By the way, secular Judaism out of secular Zionism, out of labor Zionism, would be the forerunner of what ultimately would be the Israeli Jewish secular identity. How can secular also be a religion? Well, labor Zionism showed us how that could be. And Rav Kook was the first to go ahead and say, we are all tools in ultimately creating the same outcome. And therefore, we have to be here together. He was one known to reach out and have Jews join together. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, or Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky, also an early Zionist leader. He starts off in Russia as one being caught up in that literary bourgeoisie that was developing in the same era of Chaim Nachman Bialik being caught up in this. He even has a pen name as he writes journals called Altalena. I mentioned that because we're gonna hear that name a little bit later down the road. But being very much influenced by the likes of Theodor Herzl, he is going to immigrate during that second Aliyah period and will be of the first who understand the importance of Jewish strength to defend ourselves, which would, by the way, was an integral part of the ideology of the second Aliyah. During World War I, he will be one of the main instigators or proponents of this idea of joining the British in an active Jewish fighting unit to liberate the land of Israel. He will, however, after the British do receive a mandate over Palestine, and by the way, we will, of course, break that down. I'm just jumping ahead a bit. He will ultimately be disillusioned with the likes of the idealism of Herzl, the actions of David Ben-Gurion, and the response of the British not following through with what they promised, and therefore will re-envision what Zionism could look like, and therefore, by the early 1920s, will be the leader of what ultimately would be known as revisionism Zionism. And it will be Jabotinsky who will be the spiritual father of a political party that ultimately develops alongside the Labor Party called the Likud Party. Now, we'll get to how that all plays out, but that's who Jabotinsky is. And maybe we'll tap into one more stream of Zionism, Achad Ha'am. If Jabotinsky was very much an early follower and a true partner with Theodor Herzl's ideals of creating a Jewish state in the land and ultimately reimagine what that Zionism looked like, Achad Ha'am, already from the 1880s, was against this idea of directing the Jewish people first and foremost to create a state. First, he said, we need a Jewish revival. We need a cultural Jewish revival in the old country, that is in Russia in this particular instance. And then we could make our way to the land of Israel to create Jewish culture and to strengthen Jewish identity through that spirituality. And that would not only strengthen Jews in the land of Israel, it would strengthen Jews around the Jewish world, as different countries would see what we're able to create in the land of Israel. And they would then say, hey, we have Jews in our own countries, maybe we should give them a little bit more freedoms. Now, while he understood the importance of Jewish tradition, it would be the culture that emanates from that tradition that would be, well, his forte, as he taught us that more than Jews have kept Shabbat over time, it's been Shabbat which has kept the Jews, in the sense that this has bound us, and we need to once again imagine what could bind us. Now, this all plays out in the backdrop of what will perhaps be the major turning point of the geopolitical reality that unfolds in the Middle East, that gives us much of the mess that we have today. And that has to do with, well, the British influence here in the Middle East during World War I. And we start off in 1915 with something known as the McMahon Letters. And the McMahon Letters are going to be presented to us by the High Commission, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, in a series of 10 letters and correspondence that are sent back and forth between him and the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And the idea with which to tap into some kind of union with the Arab Muslim leadership in Arabia. By the way, Hussein of Mecca was 37 generations from Muhammad himself. So clearly a very central pillar within Islam. He actually was given the position very early in the 20th century by the Sultan of Turkey, who would designate him as the ruler of Islam in the Middle East, and in particular in control of the first two holiest sites to Islam, Mecca and Medina in the Arabian Peninsula. But these letters that went back and forth essentially was an attempt by the British to bring Hussein into the fold, to recognize, we know you as the true leader, the Arab Muslim leader here in the Middle East, and the Turks are not Arab, even though they may be Muslim. They're calling for a jihad against the British in the Middle East. We want you, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, to join us, and if you do, we will provide you with a country of your own. We can't tell you exactly where that country is going to be or what that country is going to look like, but you will be given by us at the end, when the dust settles, a country for yourselves. Now, this idea of unifying the Arabs was actually going to work out, because the mostly Bedouin, semi-nomadic Muslim Arab tribes would be gathered up at the beck and call of Sharif Hussein of Mecca, but the right-hand man of McMahon was going to be a guy by the name of Lawrence, later to be known, of course, of Lawrence of Arabia. But that was 1915. 1916, the British are going to back the proverbial horse number 2. And that was going to essentially say, we are going to draw lines in the sand between us and the French in what would ultimately be known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement went ahead and said, let's divvy up the Middle East into countries of control and countries of influence, primarily between the French and the British. There were a few other superpowers involved, but primarily that would be the case. And while we have a whole bunch of colors here on the screen, let's find ourselves with a more zoomed in map of what the Sykes-Picot Agreement would look like. Who would be control of certain countries, who would have influence in certain countries. And if this map isn't clear enough, let's just move that to the side and just once again take a look and to see that what areas would France be given, what would the British take for themselves, what would be the red zone, the blue zone, etc. Honestly, between you and me, it's secondary what specifically they would receive. What's primary here is that they could care less of who was living on the land at the time. When World War I was going to ultimately come to an end, the British and the French would divvy up the region as they saw fit, as they had been doing throughout the 19th century for sure. Now, there's just a few other things that unfold here that I think we need to identify, and that is, in particular, one other proverbial horse that the British are going to back. It seems like they're hedging their bets. And we have Mr. Balfour here, Lord Balfour, that is, the foreign minister of His Majesty's government, King George V, who is going to essentially say in 1917, well, he's going to write a letter to the most important Jew that he knew, and that was Lord Rothschild of the British side of the family. And while it's a very interesting letter, let's just focus on these lines. His Majesty's government's views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Wow, that sounds amazing. And you know what? It actually means very little. What do I mean? First of all, who are the British to see with favor anything in the Middle East in 1917? And two, what exactly is a national home for the Jewish people? Is it a state? Is it a country? Is it a political entity of any kind? No idea. Oh, and by the way, where in Palestine? What exactly are the boundaries? What are the borders? What's it going to look like? Nobody knows. Ultimately, David Ben-Gurion, who, along with Chaim Weizmann, who we'll speak about later on, the leaders of the Zionist movement are going to say, we don't like this, but we will take it. And this is going to be known as the Balfour Declaration. Now, fortunately, we have the same desk with us right now that allows us during World War I to understand what, in fact, was the role of the Jewish people during that World War I. Did we, in fact, just sit idly by? Hint, hint, we already mentioned that we didn't, but what else was going on for those Jews who were living in the land? And we have on the table, on the desk right now, you have a few images. First of all, this gentleman here was Aaron Aronson. Aaron Aronson, who grew up in the township, in the Moshava of Zichron Yaakov, that same Zichron that was built and created back during the first Aliyah, along with his sister, Sarah Aronson, and a good friend of the family, Avshalom Feinberg. The reason I'm pointing them out is because in 1915, they offer their services to the British as they establish a spy organization called Nili. Nili is an acronym for Netzach Yisrael Lo Yishaker. The strength of Israel shall not fail. And they offer their services. Why? Because Aaron Aronson was a world-renowned agronomist. He actually discovers a more resilient strain of wheat here in the Middle East and ultimately saves humanity, if you will, in the Middle East, but I digress. But because of his how well known he was, he had real freedom of passage and was able to transfer information relatively easy to the British, along with his sister Sarah and their friends. Now, they would give the British information about the Ottoman Turks, who, as we've mentioned already, have been ruling in the land of Israel, in Palestine, as it was called, for 400 years already at the tail end of this downward spiral that we mentioned during World War I, as they aligned themselves with, well, for all intents and purposes, the bad guys, as it were, the Germans during World War I. They tell the British how many troops they have, who's in control, where are their troops stationed, and at a certain point, there'll be a carrier pigeon that has messages going back and forth that is captured by the Ottoman Turks. And they realize that, well, the spy unit is up and running and is centered and based in Zichron Yaakov, in the home of the Aronsons. And they surround the home and they actually capture Sarah. They torture her to give information, which she gives up none. And they're going to take her to their headquarters in Syria. And she's able to sneak away, ultimately writes a quick letter, throws it out the window, and says to her friends, I gave up nothing. I gave up no information, and be strong, we will have a Jewish state. Clearly, I'm paraphrasing, but she then takes a gun that was hidden in a doorpost in what's called a slick, and she takes her own life so that she won't give up any information. But that's the Neely group. In addition, we have Joseph Trumpeldor, who was an officer in the Russian army. In fact, he was the most decorated Jewish officer in the Russian army. In the 1904 Russian-Japanese War, he is going to lose his left arm. He spends like 100 days in the hospital and returns to his commission. And when people say, what are you, crazy? You're going back to war? He says, well, I still have another arm to give. He too, at the beginning of this second Aliyah, will be so inspired by what Jews are doing in the land of Israel, in Palestine, as part of that second Aliyah. He will come himself and he will help train and protect those Jews. So much so that during World War I, he will be the influence behind the actions of Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who we mentioned before, as together they first create the Zion Mule Corps, which was the first attempt of the British to allow the Jews to fight alongside them in this transport unit. And then in 1917, they will both be part of what will be called the Jewish Legion, an actual bona fide Jewish fighting force with the British against the Turks here in the Middle East, whatever was needed. In 1917, in November, the British will ultimately defeat the Ottoman Turks. And General Allenby over here that we can see actually chooses to walk into the old city of Jerusalem. That's Jaffa Gate on the inside of the old city, for those of you who recognize. And he doesn't want to ride in on a horse because he doesn't want to be seen as a messianic figure. But he will wrest the control over the land of Israel from the Ottomans. This is going to be very significant because for the Jewish people who have just received the Balfour Declaration, it seems as in fact this is a messianic age. So what in fact happens as World War I comes to a close? Let's see what notes we have on the desk over here. As we said, the British win the war. Faisal Hussein, who is the son, one of the sons of Hussein of Mecca, is going to take control over Syria by force. This isn't really going to sit well with France, because if you remember back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, well, France was supposed to get Lebanon and Syria as part of the areas of control and influence. And with the various conferences that are happening, the Conference of Versailles, the Conference of Paris, which will be more focused on what's happening in our region, not to mention the San Remo Conference of 1920, we're going to see a divvying out of the ultimate three horses that were backed by the British during World War I, as France goes ahead and receives Lebanon and Syria as they're under their control. Faisal is going to be given a kingship of his own in the ways of Iraq, which was under the British control. And Abdullah I will be given a brand new country that didn't exist before World War I, and that's going to be called Transjordan. Now, just to be clear here, we have the San Remo Conference, as I mentioned, an outcropping of the Versailles Conference, the Paris Conference, and now the San Remo Conference, which says, okay, as we're reimagining the Middle East in the aftermath of World War I, let's take a look at what Palestine was during the Ottoman period, and let's go ahead and siphon off 2/3 of it to create a brand new country called Transjordan. So from the get-go, Palestine, and we spoke about the origins, the etymology of the name, is going to be divvied up into two parts. The area to the east of the Jordan River will be called Transjordan, later to be called the Kingdom of Jordan. And the area west of the Jordan River would be Palestine. Palestine and the British Mandate of Palestine. When does it become known as the British Mandate of Palestine? When the League of Nations decides to give the British a mandate over Palestine. What was a mandate and how is it different than a colony? The mandate was very simple, temporary, and the British would be in control until the locals could rule themselves. Well, that's very nice, if indeed that's how it plays out. So what happens exactly to all of those promises that were made? Well, let's see what happens. First of all, 1919, in the aftermath now of World War I, we see that which had been put on hold in 1914, that is the second Aliyah, now reinstates itself in the frame of the third Aliyah, the third wave of immigration. Ideologically, very similar to the second Aliyah. We're going to work the land, we're going to defend the land, we're going to speak Hebrew as a vernacular. Interesting enough, if the kibbutz, work as much as you can, receive as much as you need, collective was the baby of the second Aliyah, the third Aliyah would see another kind of communal agricultural settlement, a little bit less communal though, called the Moshav. Similar, but a little bit different. And I'll just, again, use my parentheses to tell us that today, the kibbutz and the Moshav look very different for the most part from the original kibbutzim. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what happens with this new wave of immigration? Remember, the British are now in control. The Ottomans have been ousted. And we have Arabs who are living here, and we have Jews who are living here. We spoke about why and when Arabs and Jews began to arrive and return, and we'll go into the demographics soon enough. But with that return, if you take a look at I don't know if I'm in your little window there, but you can see my hand going up. And as we ascend and return, interesting enough, the Arab leadership of the local Arabs that were living in Palestine at the time, a guy by the name of Hajj Amin el-Husseini, is going to instigate riots against the Jews who were living in Palestine. Both those riots would begin in the early 1920s, and later we'll see it happen again in the late 1920s. But they're riots because Jews are congregating in front of the Western Wall. And for those of you who have an image of the Kotel, of the Western Wall Plaza, this is what it looks like in the aftermath of World War I, just a narrow alleyway. But these riots would follow the waves of immigration. And an interesting cycle begins to play out. If we have immigration, then riots against the Jews, the follow-up of the British in order to implement what they called was an even-handed policy, they implement something which is called the White Papers. And this cycle repeats itself in the early 20s, the late 20s, the mid-30s, and the late 30s. And one example of this will be called the Churchill White Paper of 1922. And the Churchill White Paper of 22 says very clearly, we are going to reaffirm the Jewish right to be in Palestine. But let's just be clear. We never said that all of Palestine should be the Jewish national home. And if you misunderstood us, that's on you, not on us. Oh, in addition, we're going to remind everybody that everything to the east of the Jordan River, Transjordan, Jews aren't even allowed to live there at all. And so that there's no misunderstanding, we're going to decide how many Jews are allowed to immigrate into Palestine. So let's just make sure that everybody is on the same page. Clearly, this white paper was a serious wink towards the Arab leadership in order to curtail any kind of further unrest. As we move along, we know clearly it's been shared to us by the Arab leadership of the Arabs that were living in previously called Palestine, that Jews have to protect themselves. And in order to do that, while there was an earlier defense group of the second Aliyah called Hashomer, the Guard, which, by the way, was a first real attempt in the land of Israel to defend ourselves since the days of Shimon Bar Kokhba and the Bar Kokhba rebellion of 132 to the Common Era, it would be the establishment of the Haganah, which was literally means the defense, which would be the main body of defense. In fact, the first Jewish army in the land of Israel until the establishment of the IDF, that would set the yardstick of how Jews would defend themselves in the land of Israel. And their purpose was to defend the Yeshuv. By the way, the word Yeshuv means settlement. Now, let's just make sure we remove from us any modern concoctions or connotations we have to the word settlement, and just remember that the word actually means settlement. And therefore, the Jewish existence in Palestine up until the establishment of the state of Israel was called the Yeshuv. And the Haganah was there to defend. Now, that's very nice, even so much so that David Ben-Gurion himself would make it very clear that the state of Israel would not have been founded if it wasn't for the Haganah, as that became the backdrop and the backbone of ultimately the Israel Defense Force, the IDF. It would become clear to the Jews living in Palestine that these waves of immigration that were happening, because we've already mentioned three, but in the mid-1920s, we have the fourth Aliyah that will lead us into the fifth Aliyah in the early 1930s, and we'll see that each wave of immigration will bring with it immigration, riots against the Jews, and then white papers, you can't come in, you can't purchase land, we, the British, will decide. And the riots that are ignited in the late 1920s in Jerusalem and in other places will be so painful and prominent in our consciousness that Jews are going to have to figure out clearly what we've done so far to defend ourselves isn't working. We need to do something else. And these riots in which Jews are being literally chased out of the old city of Jerusalem will really play out painfully in the city of Hebron. And there was a very strong Jewish community in Hebron. In fact, a Jewish community that never left 2,000 years earlier. There were about 700 Jews that were living in Hebron. And when the riots are ignited by Hajj Amin al-Husseini, those Jews who were living amongst these Arabs with very cordial relations, even friendships, are going to be overrun. And the testimony of survivors of the Hebron massacres, in which 67, almost about 10% of the Jewish community of Hebron will be massacred, and that's not a hyperbole. Again, I want to refer us back to what happened in the aftermath of October 7th on that fateful Shabbat. Those stories played out in Hebron as well. Every element of pain that we suffered in those kibbutzim were suffered in Hebron as well. That should be said, though, that there were also about 400 of the Jews who were protected and saved by other Arab neighbors, and yet that doesn't take away from also the terrible massacre that took place. And because of this, and if we look at the numbers, first of all, of the demographics, and I want to be clear, this is one particular chart, and depending on where you look, you might find slightly different numbers. But more or less, this gives us a little bit of a working frame through which to understand the demographics of who was living in the land. And you may notice that if in 1882, 24,000 Jews, and this is before the waves of immigration come, and about 10%, that those Jews were 10% of the population, bringing us to about 300%. The Jewish percentage was 8 to 10%. If you jump down to 1918, you can see that the Jews are now 60,000 people, and the Arabs are now 600,000 people, which is why our percentage hasn't changed that much. What am I trying to say? that we're seeing, along with Jewish immigration to the land of Israel, to what was previously called Palestine, we're seeing waves of immigration of Arab population coming from Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, because with the waves of immigration and in the aftermath of World War I, we're going to see the infrastructure of Palestine jump forward tenfold. And therefore, this is a good place to make some money and raise a family. And while there is already a rising Arab nationalism that's developing in Palestine, we don't yet hear in the public space en masse the group of Arabs living in Palestine identifying themselves as Palestinians. That isn't to say that we don't have Palestinians today. But if we want to be true to the context in which history unfolds, you even have Arabs, publicly speaking, in Palestine, who are saying, don't call us Palestinians, we are part of greater Syria. Again, doesn't take away from the nationalism that ultimately develops, but we're trying to see things as they unfold. Now, within all of this, if we're already speaking of things as they unfold, America has the roaring 20s, Palestine has the roaring 30s, as Tel Aviv becomes the happening place and will be the embodiment of that Achad Ha'amness of Jewish culture par excellence, playing out within the backdrop of the new Jew identity brought with the second Aliyah Urs. What do I mean? I mean, the coffee scene, the coffee house scene in Tel Aviv was crazy. And the party scene, the parades, the Ad Lo Yada Purim parade rivaled the Macy's Day Parade in New York City. That's what it was all about. And of course, we're now ending the Olympics with 7 medals for the state of Israel, which has broken our own record of 4 from the last Olympics. But look at me, I digress. 1932, those Jewish Olympics in Tel Aviv, the Maccabiah Games, will be, well, in a sense, it will place the Jewish Yeshuv on the map of the Jewish world. Painfully, of course, many of the athletes who participated in the Maccabiah Games will return to their homes in Europe and will not survive the Holocaust. New creativity is happening. New forms of Jewish culture is developing. Nahum Gutman, Reuven Rubin, both of the earliest founders of a new stream of art that's developing in the land of Israel to be called the land of Israel style of art, is on the one hand Nahum Gutman with some almost a simplistic childlike view of the early days of Tel Aviv. Not to say that what he did wasn't difficult, but he provides for us perhaps the lens through which the early Zionists saw the development. Everything else was yellow around. There was nothing here. We had our blinders on, and look at what we created, including the first Hebrew High. Not a Hebrew High that meets on Tuesday afternoons, but a Jewish high school in which the language of tutorial would be Hebrew, in which we would study geography and science and math and languages. It was a modern city of Jews. And if we look at Reuven Rubin, this triptych that he's created here very clearly identified the strong, powerful new Jew tapping into an old Jew thousands of years ago in the land, strong, broad-shouldered, bronze-skinned, greeting those immigrants coming from Europe and from Yemen. They were powerless to the strength of the Jew who was there to welcome. And you may notice, by the way, the fruits that he's offering, bananas and watermelon. Of course, it says in the book of Genesis, ye shall eat your watermelon. Of course not. Why these fruits and not pomegranates and figs? Because we're creating something out of nothing. And if we're speaking already of blinders, look on the sides of the triptych. We have the Arab shepherds who were there. Now, please note, I'm not saying this to disparage those early Zionists, but to provide for us literally a lens through which to see how they may have seen the land that they were engaged in rebuilding. And through this rebuilding was defense. And if the Haganah, which means defense, wasn't enough, we have to be more offensive. And sometimes we need to take our fight to the enemy. And therefore, the Irgun Tzva'i Le'umi, the national military organization, was formed, known also by its acronym, the Etzel, or sometimes just by the first word, the Irgun. The Irgun, which you may remember, inspired by Ze'ev Jabotinsky, would have an early leader of the Irgun, of the Etzel, who would be of those born within the inspirational influence of Joseph Trumpeldor, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, and in particular, we have this guy over here, a guy by the name of Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin, who would be the head of the Etzel, and later the head of the Likud, and later would be prime minister in the 1970s. As we are learning how to defend ourselves in the 1930s, the British actually send over an officer, a guy by the name of Charles Ord Wingate. He will be the son of Christian missionaries. He falls in love, grows up loving the people of Israel, the land of Israel, and of course, both the Old, as he would call it, and the New Testament. He will also be the father of all special forces and special operators, as he essentially invents this kind of special operations, and he will be brought to Palestine to help train the young kibbutzniks to defend themselves. Now, is it the British all of a sudden became ardent Zionists? No, they just wanted the Jews to have the tools to defend themselves of what the British no doubt understood would be another onslaught by the Arab leadership here. And so they wouldn't have to get involved. Now, the problem is that Ord, who gathers in these kibbutzniks and creates what's called the night squads of Wingate, that later will play out into becoming known as the Palmach. The Palmach is an acronym for Plugot HaMachatz, which means the crack commando unit, and it would be the commando unit of the Haganah. But he so much falls in love with these young Jewish Zionist pioneer kibbutzniks, the British think he get a little too close and ultimately will kick him out of Palestine, and very painfully he will lose his life later training British and American special operators during World War II. In addition to the Palmach, which is formed, we also have another organization that's born out of the Haganah called the Mossad LaAliyah Bet, or the Organization for Clandestine Immigration. As many of you know, Aleph, Bet is the second letter of our alphabet. This is not the second Aliyah, but rather another tier of Aliyah. That is a secret one. What the British would actually call illegal immigration, the Jews would call it clandestine immigration, or Aliyah Bet in Hebrew. The Mossad LaAliyah Bet was created in order to smuggle Jews in under the noses of the British, because the British weren't allowing, because of the white papers, free immigration. And in the 1920s and 1930s, this might have been just an annoyance. By 1939, when the white papers were still in effect, it would be a matter of life and death. Now, once again, I want to pause to talk about an individual, and that is Leah Goldberg. And Leah Goldberg, who was born in Lithuania, part of the Russian Empire, is going to be a young woman who already from a young age, by the age of 12, she's keeping a journal, a diary in Hebrew, as she's learning languages and absorbing them, so much so that by 1935, she has already earned her PhD from universities in Germany in comparative literature. She will immigrate to Palestine and become an integral figure of that literary bourgeoisie that's developing in the golden age of Tel Aviv. Remember the Roaring 30s. mostly male dominated. She is a powerful voice and a lone female voice, at least at that particular time. She will become one of our most prominent writers, both poetry, novels, and translators and professors of literature. At a certain point, she's going to move to Jerusalem, where she will ultimately end out her life in 1970. And she will also be such a prominent figure in Israeli life that she too makes it to our one of our notes. So we have both Rachel on the 20 shekel and Leah Goldberg on our 100 shekel. Now, I want to share with you one poem of Leah Goldberg's. And she writes this in the early 1950s. Interesting enough, I think the words that she writes are words that can only be written, or at least in my mind, after one grows into their own skin, and only after one who has achieved a thing or two are able to look back and maybe even forgive their younger self. Because as immigrants, and for those of you who have family, and maybe you yourselves who have immigrated to the United States, and maybe they too got on a different boat back in 1880s and made their way to the shores of Ellis Island and beyond, know what that first generation of American through family lore goes through. And that it's not easy because yes, we're all together, but you have to be like us. And you have to leave your past behind. At least that was the case of the early Zionists. And she is able to reflect back on an earlier self, and I think in many ways in this particular poem is able to maybe forgive herself and to acknowledge it is okay to have our roots in more than one place, because we are the sum total of all of the parts that make us who we are. Now, we're very lucky that we have with us the voice of Achinoam Nini, internationally one of Israel's most profound and well-known singers. She goes by Noah. Achinoam Nini, who was born in Israel, who was born to parents of Yemenite origin, will, at a young age, move with her family to the United States, where she spends her formative years before she returns to Israel to serve in the IDF. She will take the words of Leah Goldberg and sing in what is, I think, a beautiful rendition of these words, but she also offers one verse in English as well. We're going to listen to, you'll see there's subtitles as well if you want.
בצל האורנים האלה כל ילדותי שקמה לתחייה צלצול המחטים היה אקרא מונדת למרחב קרח ירק קובל הפלג ללשון השיר בארץ נוכריה Well, I remember those snow-capped mountains and the song on FM 93 Oh my my roots on both sides of the sea.
So we sometimes think of those early Zionists and those pioneers, oh, they just came over and they built everything up, but there was real challenge as well. And what happens to one's identity when you leave your other world behind? Do you have to leave it behind, or can you bring it with you? This too is part of the process. In 1936, we have the beginning of what will be known as the Arab Revolt. And along with those Hajj Amin-infused riots against the Jews, this will be targeted both against the Jews and the British. And at a certain point, about 6 months in, the British are going to send a fact-finding team called the Peel Partition Plan that will be sent to figure it out. This is Lord Peel over here, who is going to lead this commission and to maybe give a solution of how to stop these riots. Now, the reason I'm sharing you now a cartoon that came out in 1938, it came out in the aftermath of a couple of months after what was known as the Evian Conference. The Evian Conference of 1938 happened in July, when the world comes together to save the Jewish refugees of Germany. And they gather in a beautiful chateau in France, and they want to figure out, okay, how do we save these 400,000 Jews who are about to become refugees? Well, each country gets up and says why it's important to save the Jews, and then they go on to say why they themselves can't. Whether it's Australia that says, well, we have no racial problems, we're not looking to import one, or it's Canada that says none are too many, or it's the United States that says, well, we've already filled our quota of German immigrants and therefore can't take any more. Whatever the case may have been, we can see in this cartoon, there really is nowhere for Jews to go. And the reason I share it is because this man over here, Chaim Weizmann, originally from Russia, becomes a British citizen. He is going to be, while an ardent Zionist, he's also a scientist. He's actually a chemist, and he invents synthetic acetone, which, in addition to nail polish remover, helps the British win World War I. And actually, they respect him very much so, which is what gives him also his gravitas in being able to lead the Jewish people in Palestine vis-a-vis the British. And he makes it very clear to the British that these white papers can't continue. The Jew is argumentative, he says. We can't take no for an answer. If we're thrown out the door, we come in through the window. Why am I saying this? Is because this commission, which is going to bring in Chaim Weizmann and other Zionist leaders to speak to figure out the problem, will also approach the Arab leadership of Palestine. And Hajj Amin will actually go ahead and reject this commission. And when he does share his words, he says very clearly, as you can read here, we will never accept any place for the Jews in Palestine. That Western Wall is absolutely 100% a Muslim place. There is no sharing of anything here. Hajj Amin, by the way, El-Husseini will be kicked out of Palestine by the British when World War II begins, because he is an active agent of the enemy as far as the British are concerned. And we can see here both saluting Muslim troops as they prepare to follow through and eventually do what is needed to do for the Nazis. He also is going to meet himself in 1941 with Adolf Hitler. So this is what we're dealing with. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with is the outcome of this Peel Partition Plan. And while it seems that things are coming to a head, early in 1937, the British are going to ultimately, after interviewing Chaim Weizmann, who is open, he says, to dividing Palestine into two parts to share it with the Arabs who are here, the British are going to go ahead and break away from their earlier offer of this Peel Partition Plan that was ultimately going to create two, well, no more and no less than cantons, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. What we see in July of 37 is this. The area that you can see in green, that on the map would be a corridor controlled by the British. The area in pink that you can see there on the map would be the area that would become an Arab state. By the way, an Arab state to be added to the 22 other Arab states that were created in the aftermath of the San Remo Conference of 1920. And the area in peach that you can see on the screen is going to be the Jewish state, if this in fact will be accepted by all sides. The one Jewish state amongst all of the other Arab states in the region. And the Jewish leadership at the time says, we'll take it. And the Arab leadership at the time says, we won't take it. And this then you can see on the screen right now as the Peel partition plan is rejected, the McDonald White Paper will be put into place. And this McDonald White Paper on the eve of World War II is going to once again tell the Jews, we are putting restrictions on Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchase. And that will leave us in 1939 with a choice to make. What is the Jewish community here in Palestine going to do? Will we join the British? Will we fight against the British? Will we continue to smuggle Jews in? And what we ultimately end up seeing is David Ben-Gurion making a very clear statement. He says, on the eve of World War II, we will fight the British as if there is no Hitler, and we will fight Hitler as if there is no white paper. What does that mean? He says, we will continue to smuggle Jews in under the noses of the British, but we will join the fight, and whatever the British need, whether it's to join their army and fight in Europe, or it's to join their army and fight in North Africa, to stop Rommel on his way in as the threat was, we will do what we need to do. Now, how does that play out? What do we see happen during World War II in Palestine? And as I'm sure you can recognize, we're not going to be giving the history of the Holocaust in this course. So when we step over it, it's not because it's not important, it's just not part of what we're going to do. The question is, what happens in the aftermath of World War II? How did we in fact join the British? How did we fight? What happens when the war is over? Will the British let us in? And how does that play out with the establishment of the State of Israel? But more importantly, are we able to establish? And what happens when we do establish in the first couple of decades? All of that we will do in our next class. Okay, there you go.
Wow.
Fantastic.
And Ori, I got to tell you, yeah, that's amazing. And as Hannah mentioned last week, and I'll mention again this week, the visuals on that PowerPoint are so creative. I'm like, need to take some notes on those visuals. This has been great.
I'll tell you that when I was learning, this was I really had never done anything with PowerPoint before, and necessity of obviously opens up windows and doors. I would get so excited when I would tell them, I would find a new transition. I would call the girls over when they were younger, and I'd say, look, it fades away. They'd be like, yeah, we learned that. Great, thank you very much.
Ori, we are so grateful. I put Ori's email address into the text, into the chat. If you have any follow-up questions, we're so grateful. And I think next week, although I don't have the document in front of us, but certainly next week, we're going to be talking about the that which leads up to the establishment of the State of Israel, and probably even the Declaration of Independence itself.
Yeah.
Once again, if you want to go back, all of these sessions are on our YouTube page, available for you to look at if necessary, or for you to share with a loved one if you feel like it's worthy. Ori, many thanks. It's still a civilized time for you. Looks like it's 6:30, so you still have a chance to go get some dinner or something like that. Have a little nosh, and still have the rest of the evening in front of you. We have the rest of the day to kind of mull over what this meant and how meaningful it was, and think about it. So anyway, best to everybody. And we look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.
Let me just add one last thing, is that by the time we meet again, we will have gone through Tisha B'Av, right? The 9th day of Av.
Right.
And interesting enough, we'll see also how that plays out, whether or not, as we know from history, our enemies have identified the 9th day of Av, which was the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, as a day in which they could harness to make our suffering even worse, whether it was the expulsion from Spain or, of course, moments in the Holocaust. And it'll be interesting to see what happens within our region over the course of the next few days, and how that plays out. Not to mention also a reflection on what does this ancient memory of a destroyed temple offer us in our modern day, given the realities of post-October 7th.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, this is, we are all kind of on Spilkies, a little worried about what it might mean, and we hope obviously for anything which is just uneventful. What we're hoping for is something uneventful. And anyway, many thanks to you, Ori. Thanks to everyone who's been on, and we look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.
And Ari and Hannah, can you stay on for just a moment? I have a question for you both.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
I'm going to stop the recording, though.
Yeah.
Let's see, how do I do that?